So first one, Center for New American Security, and Lauren, take it away.
All right. Hey guys, I'm Lauren DeYoung-Schulman. I had a group that was all about winning the future, WTF. I selected this. Let me explain. We basically generated actually many more, but ultimately 3 scenarios about what the future information space is going to look like in about 10 years. And I did this for a couple of reasons. One, we as a community, whether we are in government, in technology, in education, and news, tend to focus on the problem directly in front of our face and maybe just ever so slightly further. But we're kind of terrible at projecting out what is this threat, what is this challenge going to look like anytime beyond that. People talk about deep fakes, people talk about artificial intelligence enabled micro-targeting, and these are things that we're like, I kind of have thought through what that means for me, but not really beyond next 6 months or so. So I wanted to take a lot of the trends that we see forming in the information space right now and think those through to their extreme ends, and how would those trends interact to create different kinds of worlds that we should be either worried about or maybe actually we should prepare for. So what we did today, as I completely wore my groups out, and they were amazing, gave me tons of creative ideas, is use scenario planning, an extremely accelerated version of that model, to create worlds that I'll brief you about in just a second. Soon, hopefully in the fall, I'll create a podcast series that will go over these worlds in detail and explain how you might prepare for them or the implications. And over the long term, since I got to do my practice session today, we will use this game in order to have bigger groups, different groups, think through the same questions and process. So the future that we want, no matter what kind of trends we're going on, are access to the truth in the short term and limited corrosion of public discourse in the long term. I just told everyone, you don't get to argue with me. Here's the vision of the world that I want. You just have to agree with me. And the biggest question that we wanted to be able to answer, no matter what the world was in 10 years, what will the information space look like? And then what kind of capabilities do governments in particular, but not just governments, other institutions need to identify and communicate the truth? So that's a very broad question because all the worlds we created were super different. You're not going to be able to read this, but the more detailed questions that I asked folks once we created our worlds were things like, if you could invest in anything today to prepare for your world, what would it be? What kind of skills do we need as a community to develop over the next 10 years in order to survive in this world or maybe do better than the world that we're looking at? What kind of partnerships should we start building now? What kind of information sharing infrastructure do you need? Or what kind of information protection do you need in order to actually survive in this world? What laws would you get rid of? How would you redesign government? What kind of foreign policy would you want to have? Things to think through. How do you actually thrive in the worlds we're creating instead of just having it be a horrible dystopia, which we created, don't worry. The 3 worlds that we worked out in detail were the rise of the demagogues, the dystopia of uninformed and distrustful people, and a fractured and manipulated society. Basically, they all kind of sucked. So we took extremes of not trusting media, of having AV manipulation, of little trust in democratic institutions, and a rise of populism and tribalism, and brought those out to the logical extremes and to see how they interacted. But what was interesting is when we asked people how you would prepare for them, no matter how different those worlds were, there were several commonalities in what people said, here's what I would want to do to either prevent that world from happening or prepare ourselves to be able to survive in it. So obvious ones like education, to include digital and civic literacy, to really focus on strengthening the role of local and community governments and empowering individuals, as well, in particular, empowering local news sources. One interesting element of that I thought was really unique was talking about better multi-generational engagement within local communities, because a lot of the political divisions we see are less between different economic bodies and more between generations. So it was an interesting point that I thought worth highlighting. Getting rid of institutional incentives for bipartisanship and polarization. I'm sorry, not for bipartisanship. Getting rid of institutional incentives for polarization, like gerrymandering, or first-past-the-post democratic voting institutions. Those are things that people were worried about and we should try to get rid of. There was an interesting theme across all groups of generating solutions that were very human oriented and not technology oriented, which I think is worth highlighting in a group of people that quite often kind of turns to the how do we use algorithms to solve the world. The last few I'll highlight are groups that focused on historical preservation, so making sure we are saving our history, but also increasing historical education so we understand it better. The skills of self-sufficiency, resilience, leadership, and the ability to disconnect from technology in all kinds of ways, both in terms of our communication as well as our government, were all things that people said that we needed to invest in. And lastly, I can barely read this, an obvious one, but I'll say it anyway, is to strengthen democratic institutions. So each of these had interesting commonalities across the worlds that we created, so clearly we should be investing in all of them now, and that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. That was great. All right, next presentation. Can we load that on the screen, please, AV team? So how's everyone doing? All right, mapping the solution space. Harmony Labs and Mozilla. Can someone from Harmony Labs and or Mozilla, hello. Great.
I got nominated. I'm not with either of them.
All right.
Hello, I'm Susan Polton. I'm not with Harmony Labs or Mozilla, but our amazing team had them and got nominated to come and represent them. And we did a thought exercise on mapping the solution space. So everyone put every concept, every piece of research, every solution, every idea that they had heard in this space down. And we tried to find a matrix in which we could map and group these solutions, and this is what we came up with. So first, there's a lot of people are already thinking about and working in this space. Obviously, everyone in this room is working on solutions, and so we were drawing on most of the work that's well known here, as well as discovering a few new things that some hadn't heard about. Needless to say, it's complex, and some of the common categories that emerged were researched, fact-checking, media literacy, government regulation, industry standards, collaboration, and different tools. This is kind of what it looked like. And I think the big takeaway here, we tried to come up with several matrices in which you could map all these solutions. On the far left, you had research and theory, and on the far right, you had practice, which I know is something that the Credibility Coalition has also kind of framework that they've experimented with. And then we tried to go from high complexity to low complexity. We also experimented with an x-axis that would have time frame for solution, whether it's a short-term solution or a long-term solution. So there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice all of these different solutions. But what we were looking for is the gaps. Now, just to frame it, this is the biases of the folks that were in this room. So there was not a lot of expertise in the research area. There was a lot of us in the room who were definitely in the solutions and the practice area, which you can see over on the right. But essentially what I think the gaps that we discovered is that we're missing a lot of the research in at least our knowledge base of this. The research is probably out there, but we don't know about it. Down at the bottom, nothing is simple. Everything is kind of in the complex space, and that we're working on a lot of solutions. But I think the big takeaway that this could become is a matrices. So instead of having spreadsheets of lists of opportunities that everybody here is working on, how can we come up with a better visualization to identify collaboration on these different things? Either core areas, because now's the time for us to start collaborating. And we need consolidation. We have tons of people working in certain spaces, and we all kind of need to come together and apply for these fundings on certain platforms and consolidate and collaborate. That there's a bit of a silo between practice and research. You've got research happening over here in academia. You've got practices over here, but they're not necessarily informing each other. And that we don't have an efficacy framework for real-time research. So how are we testing the things we are doing and feeding that data back to people who are experimenting and doing the research so that they know what's effective and what isn't effective. So the hope is that this big hot mess can become more of a open source, crowdsourced framework that we can build on that can help us visualize those collaborations. Thanks.
Can the Credco folks please come up? Credibility Coalition. Connie. This is going to be a tremendous presentation because I am working for the Credibility Coalition. This is going to be great. Yeah.
We couldn't do it.
We might have to zoom in a little because I think there's literally screen sharing. There we go. Okay. Okay.
We can just go to the, how does this work? Can we advance them?
No, you're literally going to have to say next slide.
Next slide. I just want to go to the one. Keep on going next. It's in backward order. Next. That's one. Okay, good.
Technology. All right.
Hi. So it was really great, actually, to follow on the heels of that one, because we did also work on our MisinfoCon map. My name is Connie Moonsaha, and I'm part of the Credibility Coalition. I'll be speaking a little bit more of our approach to trying to find frameworks that allow for collaboration tomorrow. But today what we decided to do was to focus in two specific areas. One is that we wanted to kind of think about a couple of different frameworks, specifically in the areas of elections. And the second was also to think about some of these frameworks that we're working on in the Credibility Coalition, specifically around the area of private messaging spaces. So maybe just to kind of condense it in a few, three broad areas. First, we worked on something that we called the Misinfo map. Thank you so much for the reference earlier to the Credibility Coalition. And this is something that we've been developing over the last month, in which, again, we don't want to duplicate efforts. We thought that we could try to come up with a framework that allows people to situate their own work within a specific context and to see who else is collaborating in the space, but also to ask questions that prompt people to deeper inquiry, as well as to think about if there's sufficient responses in specific areas related to disinformation and misinformation. So one way that we think about it is, to what extent does your project on an axis between theory and practice? In other words, is it trying to understand the problem of misinformation or disinformation? Is it trying to shape the quality of information they're actually engaging with? The second axis that we have is between infrastructure and content. So to what extent are you actually dealing with the means of communication? You might be more interested in the term medium in this case versus the message. And then really wanting to think about the dimensions of diversity, of language, of country, of theme. And so our first study actually had to do with, excuse me, our first study had to do with, that we published earlier this year, had to do with scientific content. But we were like, well, what happens when you enter the world of elections? So that's what we did, and we want to share that really pretty map with you. We have actually a developing Airtable, and we are working on data visualization, so we're really eager to share that. The second thing that we did was we worked on indicators related to elections, trying to think about what are the specific signals? What about content-related signals? Does it matter if content is hyperpartisan? Do you want hyperpartisan content? Maybe, though, in terms of an election, maybe that's part of what should be allowed. We asked questions about what kind of indicators related to context. Does aggressive ad placement indicate something about credible information? We also asked about, posed the question of indicators related to user behaviors. If you see a certain number of posts per second, which indicates a bot, does that signify something? But again, even if it signals something about credibility, to what extent do some of these behaviors need to flourish in a functioning democracy? So we brainstormed about more indicators, in which we'll be sharing, again, also in terms of our infrastructures for, in partnership with the W3C, Credible Web Community, and I think Sandro is also here somewhere. Oh, there he is, there. So hopefully you can learn more about that. And then finally, when we talked about private messaging spaces, we talked about specific methods in terms of how we might do research in this space, but also the ethics involved. And maybe the final thing that will end is that we came up with some approaches to try and figure out what it would mean to study this space. But given that it is private messaging space, we ended with a sort of challenge to ourselves. Are the requirements higher for people interested in doing rigorous research in these spaces in terms of what happens if there's a breach in privacy? In other words, these spaces are meant to be private spaces. If we're doing research, and information that we've anonymized becomes identified even though we've tried to de-identify it. To what extent is that problematic when we engage in these spaces? So that's what we did, and this is why we worry about our lack of pretty slides. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to put a quick plug in for Credco. I am looking to partner with journalism schools and journalism students. So if anyone here is affiliated with a journalism school, please come talk to me because we're looking to hire students to annotate articles based on specific indicators that we've identified. So please come talk to me today or tomorrow if you are affiliated with an institution, academic institution. Thank you. All right, next presentation is going to be
Meanwhile, MisinfoCon, the website, Medium website.
Oh, yeah. Oh, here we go. All right, witness. Witness.
Pretty slides.
Yes. Great.
We're going to tag team on this one. We had pre-prepared pretty slides, so we cheated. She totally cheated. So we started off just by kind of surveying what was happening, and we've put the link at the top to a bunch of our notes and sort of information and resource links. We were building off a convening that happened about a month ago that First Draft and Witness led. That was a day-long convening looking at solutions in this space, so we shared some of the backdrop of that to start with. And then we wanted just to kind of get a baseline on the tools here. We think there's one of the problems is the challenge of people understanding what we mean when we talk about deepfakes. So we looked at kind of the range of ways we might think about this so we can actually make realistic threat assessments. The other thing we're really trying to do is sort of demystify the kind of information apocalypse type approach to this where it's separating it from so many other trends and also creating the damage around the sort of public trust issues when we talk about it in those terms. And we included the longer slide deck is in the notes that you could see from the link before. And we were looking at, a range of ways of trying to understand how this might play out, how people might make subtle edits to content, how they might create what we described as doppelgangers of individuals, kind of credible doppelgangers. And then this bigger threat that I think we've been talking about a lot recently, and certainly in the US political context of kind of plausible deniability, the way in which volume of deepfake content can also create disruption in the information ecosystem, which is obviously in alignment with so much of what we're seeing already. And then we moved on to thinking about threat models and solution areas. And we decided to focus on three threat areas based on the group's interests. So we looked at kind of the big problem of kind of collapse of truth and generalized effect on society when we look at a volume of fake information, particularly playing to some of the things that we described as possibly novel with kind of deepfakes and other synthetic media. So the visual nature, the possibility that it's individualized, the way that many more people can create this type of information that we've had less experience dealing with as faked information, i.e. individualized audio and visual information that is manipulated. And then the second one was a crisis event. We ended up focusing on national, localized, and then targeting of activists.
Yeah, so let's see, I guess here is the mic. So if you're looking at sort of the collapse of truth, there's two, I'm trying to figure out how to, did you want to frame this
Sure.
in relation to the previous things? Because I was.
Yeah, so collapse of truth, we were trying to really think about how do you think about, what are the ways to deal with the generalized problem, not a specific incident.
And this ties into sort of that plausible deniability also. And so the solution approach is here, media literacy, how do we label content? What are the regulatory frameworks we can build around this? And I think really importantly, how do we build confidence in people that they can actually navigate this terrain? Because if they can't, then we lose that, we're in that role, the plausible deniability. Then we looked at crisis events. And so there are three things that are very interesting about crisis events, which is that scams are more believable. So it's not just the political disinformation that's a problem, but the ways in which this actually affects the likelihood that, as someone in the group said, their grandparents were almost convinced to give people money under the assumption that they had been in a car crash, just through like robocalls without even a realistic voice saying, making them appear to be that person. And so what happens when we actually have really believable voices? Even the mainstream media is more foolable when there's a crisis happening right now, and any individual is looking for what is the information that can guide them. And so examples of this are, thinking about how could terrorists sow even more confusion and conflict after an attack. How can provocateurs actually take advantage of the disasters either in financial ways or in political ways? And there's also these localized issues like that example with, can you phish someone more effectively as a result of this? And if you're dead, you can't deny that you said something very effectively as a deep fake. There's a lot of mitigations here around, best practices around crisis scenarios for publishers, for platforms, for emergency responders. What are the ways in which individuals can sort of be taught almost a first aid to stem that bleeding of misinformation? And what are the sort of the best practices around transparency that can actually facilitate this within the journalism world? And finally, this danger of targeting vulnerable journalists and activists. So you no longer need to take a real video like Project Veritas would have to do in some sense to create that. They can just use a deepfake. And so that's a whole new threat scenario. And this can also happen in niche domains where there isn't that broad visibility. So we might not even know about it if you're not in that very particular, let's say, health domain, for example. And you can do this with no cost. And so in order to address this, you need to make disinformation a beat in newsrooms, both national and local. And we really need to inoculate media. And there's actually a great report on the broad scope of disinformation by Data and Society, which is worth looking at. But inoculate media so they have the resources and support to take this stuff on.
Wait, can we go back?
Can we go back one slide?
One
please?
slide.
One slide, just so we can get the and then you can hear us.
One slide. Oh, no. Okay.
Ask him to sort of give it.
Oh.
Okay.
Just leave it there for a second.
No,
the one with the last one.
One more.
One more. Keep going.
I think we're going here. Am I able to do this?
Yeah, so yeah, I think you can do it.
Okay, so.
Try to. Are you going forward?
No.
This way or what?
Yes. Okay. There we go.
Thank you.
Can Goodly Labs and Nick Adams come up? Here he comes. No.
No. Your presentation.
Yeah.
It should be loaded up. Okay. Thanks, Dwight. I'll stand here awkwardly for a moment. You may sit there awkwardly. Here we go. So we had a breakout session where we were looking at the research tools that people can use to study disinformation, and in particular to respond to some of the recent calls for research. Do I press a button or do I?
There's a clicker.
Bam.
Green. And then
Green button.
we'll advance.
The biggest, greenest button. Okay. So what we did in the group is first we kind of mapped the research funding landscape. So there are a number of requests for proposals out there right now. Some very large, prominent ones from the Hewlett Foundation, from Social Science One, which is a collaboration among multiple funders, and Facebook, who's providing data, and then it's all led by the Social Science Research Council, who's kind of managing that collaboration. The WhatsApp call, and there was a brand new one from the Knight Foundation today. So we at least mentioned that one slightly. But we spent a little time just kind of digging into what are these different funders looking for, and what kinds of strands of research, what particular research questions are they asking so that researchers in the room can effectively respond. Next, we spent some time just kind of talking through the various social science methods that are going to be able to answer those questions, making sure we had a comprehensive understanding of what those are. So people might do surveys of folks to see did they receive a particular bit of fake news? How did they respond to it? What were their thoughts about it? Field experiments where you could actually launch your own content. And maybe it's misinformation, maybe not. You could launch it into a network and into an actual platform like Facebook and see how people respond. Online social experiments where you're not really working in one of the platforms, but you're still testing some hypothesis about how people respond to different types of misinformation. Network analyses to understand how disinformation spreads differently through networks that are constructed in different ways or take different shapes. And then deep analysis into the content of misinformation, like into the content of a news story, or what we might differentiate as context analysis, where you're not so much interested in the content of the article or the claim that's misinforming, you're interested in how it's couched. Is it couched in some other rhetoric? Is it put in a particular URL, served on a particular website? So we kind of discussed all of that with the goal, finally, of giving an opportunity to various different tool providers to show off how their tools could be effective for answering research questions using those methods. So some of these we were able to have demos for, others we just placed the links, and if you track through the documents here from MisinfoCon, you'll be able to find these links to various tools that we think will be effective for those calls. So you can do surveys through these different tools like Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey, online social experiments, Breadboard, and Dallinger. We didn't get to look at those today, but we did have representatives from Hypothesis and Check show off how their tools can be used for what we might call this context analysis. Check especially allowing these kind of task runs of tasks that people can do, and that you could actually, in your own research, or you can set up your own version of this and using their tools. Hypothesis allowing people to anchor their annotations in different places on the web so that you can trace through and see how a claim, a particular section of an article might need debunking, for instance, instead of just having to look through the entire article. We showed off the TagWorks tool for content analysis, which allows a researcher to direct potentially hundreds or thousands of people through the internet to do small little bits of content analysis that can then all be statistically stitched back together, so that a very rich, deep, high-scale content analysis job that would take years or months to do using old methods can actually be done in a matter of weeks or months. So that's a new tool that's available. We got great presentations from Phil Mincer at Indiana University showing off Hoaxy, which is really a fantastic tool for visualizing the network analyses, so you can see the spread of misinformation through networks. And you can also, with Hoaxy, you can see which nodes in a network are bots, or likely to be bots, because his team has also created this tool called Botometer, which does bot detection. So those two tools, I think, are going to be incredibly valuable for anyone who's looking at the spread of misinformation, disinformation through a network. And finally, Rebecca from FakerFact gave us a look into that tool, which can be really useful for just getting a high-level understanding of, is the content from this URL likely to be misinformation or disinformation? So maybe a really great first layer of analysis for any kind of research into the space. Everyone was really fantastic, and we learned a lot in the process, and we hope this is valuable for the whole community. Thanks.
Okay, Chris and NDI, can you guys come up? Bridging People and Platforms is the name of the presentation. By the way, DHS, do you guys have a presentation or no? You do? Okay, I'll come talk to you because I don't see it. All right, can we get NDI's presentation up, please?
This looks like a trigger for something. Okay. Hi, folks. Chris Doughton from NDI. I'm really here not so much with my NDI hat on, but rather with the Design for Democracy Coalition, which is a new initiative being started up by a number of international NGOs designed to kind of connect the major technology platforms with folks around the world. So talking about some of these problems with our group here at MisinfoCon today, so thanks very much for the opportunity. One of the core issues are whether clickers work or not. The green button, I'm colorblind. Oh. Okay. There we go. Great. Thanks. There's one with tape on it, which seems like it might be the one. Okay, great. So basically, the core conversation boiled down to the fact that a lot of the problems that we face on our technology platforms today with the spread of misinformation or disinformation are because of a lack of local context. When you take this globally, like how do you understand what's going on around the world? It has to be actually specific to every individual's context. So how do we actually do something about that? So talking through some of the problems that manifest because of this lack of local knowledge. The algorithms are not usually fueled with local languages, so hate speech, threatening speech, markers for disinformation are not necessarily recognized if they're shared in local languages. The challenge is what content sources are bogus or legitimate requires a lot of local context. Knowing the democratic schisms, demographic targeting schisms in one particular society that might be used for incitement or more dangerous trends is also something locally dependent. And how people react to disinformation, misinformation, what works for debunking or not, also depends very much on the local context. There's some other problems that we see that we discussed a little bit around our table today. How do grassroots groups get their problems solved? Should I be microphoning? Is it better if I stand here? Okay, sorry about that. I didn't think about that. Okay, so I'm a wanderer on platform, but I'll try and keep myself anchored here. So problems that are encountered at the grassroots level go into often opaque resolution processes and are not, what happens to them are a little bit limited. The research and access to data is a big conversation topic here today, but it's also particularly true for local groups who may have the knowledge to kind of put things into context. And then local fact-checking. So one of our core conversations insights the idea that connections with local grassroots groups can make things better. Every platforms have an obligation to really understand their global footprint and be able to kind of think about things in a local context. But we recognize that, with the exception of some of the real titans, not everybody can, and probably nobody should, have an office in each individual country. But how do you actually tap into the local knowledge to inform all these different challenges? So connecting with local grassroots groups can help bridge some of these gaps if they have the right sort of transmission mechanisms to grab that information and push it up. So some of the things that we're hoping could be solutions to some of these challenges, so better access to research, creation of a hotline to elevate problems being seen, particularly by some of the most vulnerable grassroots democratic or human rights organizations who often face problems that need a really time-sensitive resolution. Being able to try and work with local groups to build out lexicons of what threatening speech looks like in an indigenous language context or other things like that. Which requires knowledge from the platforms, like what is it that you need for your algorithms, how do we build that information out? And then working with local fact checkers to try and help build their capacity and think more broadly about fact checking as disinformation analysis and what we can do with that. A few other thoughts, trying to understand what the local bogus sites are in a given country context to try and make sure that advertising dollars do not flow into those sources to kind of remove some of the monetary incentives to things. Letting people know a little bit, letting the platforms know, especially with an upcoming, say, election or other kind of divisive political event or a crisis, what are some of the demographic schisms that might be targeted with malevolent intent. Trying to do research that's really on a locality basis for what are the kind of the methods of disinformation flow, what are the kind of vulnerabilities, and then trying to target media literacy micro-campaigns in that particular local context. So a lot of different challenges we've seen. So trying to think about what we can do with that. So again, Design for Democracy Coalition would love to chat with any of you folks about how to take these ideas and elevate them. The core concept is that we've got a pre-existing connection to the right people at the right platforms. And so I'm going to be starting by taking these ideas and these suggestions that we've discussed here today and bringing them up with them. Would love to get other people involved in that process and trying to share some of these issues and other ones that will come up in the future. So thanks all very much. Appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. DHS could come up. This is our final presentation of the day. Clara This is fantastic. Our last presentation. So if we load up that one, AV team. By the way, I just want to make another quick plug. I've had a lot of quick plugs, but another one, MisinfoCon.com. Everyone should go there. It's an amalgam of a bunch of different articles that people write around misinformation, and we want all of you to contribute to that. So it's Medium-based, and you should write on Medium and then email me, and we will put it up there on MisinfoCon.com. So if you want something published on our main Medium site, please write it on Medium and then email me, and we can make it happen. So with that being said, DHS.
Thank you so much. My name is Clara Tao. I'm here with my colleague Rob, and we are from the DHS Countering Foreign Influence Task Force. During our workshop, we asked the workshop participants to respond to some case studies that we had developed as a team. So Phil, he is going to actually go over some of the responses.
Sure. So I'm Phil Anderson from the State Department, and I'm going to be going over some of the case studies that we had and some of the sort of brainstorming sessions we pulled together. And sort of the approach we took to this was a framework that DHS has been.
Can someone go next slide?
I have it.
Clap our hands. Okay.
Right? This one? I think I'm hitting the green one. Doesn't appear to be working. No?
Did they just display the image that we uploaded, not the link? Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay. That's crazy. Okay, so what this is looking at is essentially a framework of how to approach misinformation, disinformation, with a particular eye towards risk management, especially from DHS's perspective. And the 3 stages were research and logistics, production, and then publication and amplification. And you don't really have to read all of the little pieces that are in there, but that is the order of the chevrons as they go across. And the idea was, can we look at each one of these 3 pieces and come up with ways to respond to it or research it or sort of create some open-ended questions for things we'd like, all the great partners that are here and other open source groups and corporations to take a look at. And the first case study we were talking about was the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury and the disinformation surrounding that. So under the research and logistics section, some of the ideas that the group came up with were formalize network analysis techniques for seeing what the communities are, which ones may be primed for accepting or sharing disinformation, sort of the idea of how does a topic or a narrative propagate throughout these communities, especially in a crisis situation, which Aviv was speaking to a little bit earlier. Another one was inoculating the audience ahead of time. So this could be either a longer term campaign along the media literacy side of things, or more of a direct and acute response to disinformation that's coming out. Some other topics were a little broader was these new threat awareness channels that may be ways for groups to share information on the research and logistics side, similar to how cybersecurity information is shared between corporations, between governments, kind of creating this environment where people feel more comfortable sharing vulnerabilities and ways that you might be able to respond to them. And then sort of that overall idea is just increased skepticism about these sort of topics and how people respond to them when they see this popping up in their channels. The second side was on production. And so this is how do you respond or investigate the content itself and how it's being shared in the initial phase. So a great idea we had was this misinformation core, or I guess a counter misinformation core. The other side is the misinformation core. And so this would help sort of be a crowdsourced and open group of people that are able to be deployed into these sort of acute situations or these crisis scenarios that might be happening. It could be journalists, it could be something similar to a Wikipedia editing system. And so these people can sort of be called up when something starts to pop off to help provide additional support for governments or corporations or journalistic outfits as they respond. Some of the broader ones as well were invest in journalism. That's a great one. A big part of this is that gets skipped over is just, a lot of small papers are shutting down, smaller outlets are being consolidated, and actually providing a lot of resources to on-the-ground local journalists is one of the best ways to produce these credible voices in local communities, which then spread to the online sphere as well. We also moved a little bit into the offline and talking more about bilateral understanding and collaborations between governments and possibly between international corporations. So we had an example of the German and Polish sort of non-interference agreements that came about during World War II and similar ones that exist now. And is there a way to sort of formalize this in treaties or at least statements saying we're not going to actively interfere. If that happens, we'll have these sort of hotlines for communication to try and deconflict. And then some of the usual, looking at verified accounts, ways to verify websites, and some of the other tools that we've seen in previous presentations. Then we get to the publication and amplification side. And two ideas we had there was a data vacuum. So when a crisis event starts, sort of the first mover often has an advantage. So a shooter's name or a location of an attack, whoever can sort of flood that keyword the fastest often gets sort of the advantage in the first few hours. And are there ways to work with companies to change algorithms or put the brakes a little bit on how those topics move to the top of people's feeds or people's search results? The second case study we were looking at was the Louisiana chemical attack, which was in 2014, right?
2014.
2014. And basically, it's a little different. The idea behind this was there was a video that was real. It was a real video, but from a different event. And people received Oh, yeah, we can go to the next one. How did we do that? We scroll down.
Scroll down. Yep.
Scroll down one more slide. Yep, there it is. And so this was a very sort of short turnaround disinformation campaign. Happened, from beginning to end within a few hours. There were obviously, latent results after the fact, but people started getting text messages saying there was an attack on a local chemical plant. Videos out of context were shared online. Journalists and sort of influencers on various platforms were reached out to directly for response to this attack. Some of them did respond, some of them didn't, but it had a very sort of direct impact on the ground of people sharing this. Some panic, people reaching out to the police and DHS and government officials asking about should they evacuate, should they shelter in place, how do you deal with this poison gas cloud that's going to be drifting over their community. And so at first people thought it was sort of a hoax, more on the 4chan-y kind of side. Got 1 minute left. But it turned out it was a Russian campaign. So it sort of expanded the research into it and looking into why might someone want to do this. A lot of these responses we came up with were similar. A few of the new ones were looking at these known accounts that were banned. Can we help train some AI models or some newer algorithms to detect that ahead of time? Also looking at sort of the non-social media space. So how does this get shared by word of mouth? What are ways of responding to SMS-based disinformation or even phone call-based disinformation? So you could see, something like an Amber Alert or a reverse 911 call to immediately respond to people who receive these fake text messages. One idea under production we thought was cool was this hoax wire service, so similar to an AP wire. Can you have some kind of RSS feed or real-time updated feed that a collaboration of journalists get together to produce, saying here are all the hoaxes we see in real time. These are the ones that are popping up, so all the other journalists know what not to respond to or what isn't actually accurate in the information space. And then in publication and amplification, we looked into getting the ground truth out faster and how you sort of create an environment where it's more successful. And then also the idea of being able to detect these sort of fake sock puppet websites ahead of time. So can you see how people are laying the groundwork for future disinformation campaigns? That's probably about the end of the time, but I wanted to say from my perspective, at least as convening body at state and a convening body at DHS, that sort of bringing all these people together to talk about these ideas is exactly what we're looking for, sort of pulling all the tools and people and resources together. So feel free to reach out.
Yep, and we would love feedback on whether this is the right framework around this research and positioning, and then to